Michelle Buuck, a longtime contributor of the History Lecture Series. Ms. Buuck graduated from Nunez Community College and is a published author. Her writings include the St. Bernard Fire Department and Hurricane Katrina and the historic Laveau Mansion. But most notably, I understand, she's a new grandmother, although when she gets up here, you will not notice it, as she is so beautiful and beautiful. And saying all that, I welcome Michelle Buuck. Let's get first things first. That's my beautiful granddaughter. Gotta get that out of the way. She'll be 3 weeks old tomorrow. And her father, is my son. And he is actually the reason I'm standing here tonight. I just want to point that out because he was one of those firefighters during Katrina. He was the youngest firefighter in the department at the time. And as a mother, when he came back and I looked at him, I could see in his eyes that he had been through something that had changed him forever. And he didn't talk about it, but what he did say to me was, Mom, you need to interview the firefighters because there's a story there. You need to interview them and write a book, there's a story there. And I wasn't really sure and had a lot of other things to think about when I really got into it and started interviewing the firefighters. Wow, there really was a story there. So what I want to say is in the 2 years it took me to research and write this book, I had to fabricate, embellish, and exaggerate absolutely nothing. Because the story laid out to me by the first responders, by the fire department, was absolutely incredible. I'd like to put a little bit of a human face on it from the perspective of the boots on the ground. These are the men and women who were out there doing the rescues. So that's kind of the position I'm going to come to you from today. Now, in preparing for Hurricane Katrina, St. Bernard Fire Chief Tommy Stone made two unprecedented decisions. Usually for a hurricane, the firefighters stayed in their firehouses, always, except for engines 11 and 12 in Wycliffe and Delacroix. For Katrina, all the fire stations were empty. Nobody stayed in a firehouse. He moved them to safe locations, multi-story buildings throughout the parish. He also staged equipment. He moved the 4 newest fire trucks 90 miles north of Chalmette to Holden, Louisiana. Now this is where the firemen would be staged. They would send 25 firefighters to Domino Sugar Refinery. 19 of them were at the parish government complex with the parish president, councilman, some members of the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department. There was also the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department Mobile Command Unit, which was going to be their hub of communication for this crisis. The Civic Center had 33 firefighters. Chalmette High School had 28. And down at St. Bernard High School, there were 4 firefighters who were also EMTs. Now these last two, it's very important to note that Chalmette High School and St. Bernard High School, Doris Voce, the superintendent of schools, decided on Sunday they were going to open them up as shelters of last resort. So for all those people who had no means to get out of St. Bernard. So the doors were open on Sunday. She asked Chief Stone to send some firemen to help. You know, the firefighters are saying goodbye to their families, they're reporting into work. This is what they always say, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Because they know they're here for the duration. No matter what happens, it's their job to be right here on the front lines. They're securing the fire stations, securing what equipment is there, and they're getting their families out of town. What they all told me across the board is, we knew we had a tough job to do coming up. And we could not do it if we had to worry about our families. We had to get them out of town, make sure they were safe. And that was the main thing that they were doing. 3 things I want to talk about real quickly. The St. Bernard Manor in Miro with some assisted living apartments, independent living apartments. Captain Mike Molkamp's mother lived in St. Bernard Manor. And she had evacuated the years before, and of course, like everybody else, left, came back 2 days later. So when he called her and said, Mom, you gotta leave, she said, I'm not leaving, I'm gonna stay. And he said, no, you have to leave for this one. This is bad, you have to leave. She said, I'm not leaving. So a bitter argument ensued between the son and the mother, and he got very frustrated and told her, well, you know, write your social security number on your thigh so they can go ahead and identify your body so I don't have to do it. She got very angry at that. So when they ended the phone call, they were not being very nice to each other. So she was convinced, she stayed in her first floor apartment at St. Bernard Manor, convinced she would be safe and she would be fine. He reported into work, convinced he was never going to see his mother again. Fire Inspector Steve Galladoro's father was at St. Rita's nursing home in St. Bernard, 82 years old, and he was wheelchair bound. And I think we all know that story. He called to make sure that they were going to be taken out and taken to safety, and they were told that they would be. They were told that their loved ones would be bussed out and taken to another shelter, another nursing home in Baton Rouge or Shreveport. Well, what happened was, at the last minute on Sunday, he found out they weren't taking them out, and it was too late to get them out. So both of these firefighters reported into work very unsure of the safety of their family. Now also, at the very last minute, Acadian Ambulance, which is the only ambulance service that's contracted to work in St. Bernard Parish, pulled all their resources out of St. Bernard. That would be equipment and personnel. And I want to take a moment right here to say that when they made this mandate and said we're pulling everybody out, there was one medic who said, no, this is what my job is, to stay for emergencies like this, so I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay with these other first responders in the trenches. And her name is Janie Fuller, and she's here tonight, so I just want to mention her. So the firefighters now, with Acadian pulling out, would be firefighters, first responders, rescuers, providers of food and shelter. They would need to get heavy equipment running. They would need to be transportation workers. Now they were going to need to provide medical attention and answer all medical calls throughout the duration of the crisis. They were going to need to do this without adequate supplies, equipment, communication, the basics like food and water, and they were going to have to do it with very little sleep and no communication with their families. It would be an unprecedented task, and when I talked to them, they pretty much all told me they were scared. They knew it was going to be bad, but they knew it was their job. So here comes Katrina, kind of bearing down on St. Bernard. They're all staged, they're all ready to go. The first place, Chalmette High School, where the 28 firefighters were stationed, 250 people arrived as a shelter of last resort. And according to Doris Gauthier, there were a lot of people there who really should have been in a hospital setting. There were several disabled people on ventilators to breathe that they brought a 2-hour backup battery for their ventilators. Several wheelchair-bound residents, elderly residents, diabetics with a limited supply of insulin, non-ambulatory patients, and several requiring oxygen. Once again, everybody had limited supplies of what they needed. St. Bernard High School had 150 residents. There was an epileptic who went into a seizure as soon as Katrina started, a teenage pregnant girl and a dialysis patient. St. Bernard Civic Center was the largest contingent of firefighters located there. There were 33 of them. Now, if I'm going to weather the worst storm in history, this is where I want to go. This all-glass building. This is a good idea, right? And what the firemen told me was, they put us in an all-glass building. Go figure. They had an interesting night because when they arrived, they unloaded all of their equipment, put it in a central location on the first floor of the building. As the night went on, they said, it's raining a lot, it may flood. Why don't we move everything up to the second floor? So they did. So now moving everything takes about an hour. They have a lot of equipment. So they moved everything to the second floor. So they get up there, and what happens is Katrina's right over, really kind of going, and the roof of the building is a big metal roof. And in the middle of the storm, that whole roof kind of peeled off, and they watched it blow across Judge Perez Drive. So what happened was all that concrete that you see, that's all that was on top of the building. So So there were several firemen who are structural certified to go look at it. They went and looked at it. They said, you know, if this porous concrete gets wet, it may collapse. And it was getting really wet. And actually the water was already starting to come into the second floor, and there was a very real danger that the whole roof may collapse. And they said, well, maybe the best place isn't the second floor. Maybe we should move back downstairs. So they did. So they moved everything back downstairs. So once they get everything downstairs, a call comes in over the radio that there may have been a breach at the Tennessee Street, and there might be some water in Araby that might be coming to Chalmette. So District Chief Glenn Ellis goes outside, looks toward Araby, and his words to me were, there was a 4-foot wall of water coming at us. And he could see the white caps, and he could just see it rolling. And he said, so I went inside and I calmly informed them that we had minutes until this water got here. So they had to move everything upstairs. So if you're counting, they were downstairs, and they were upstairs, and they were downstairs, and now they're going upstairs again. So they moved everything upstairs. Well, of course, just like Curtis described here, the water started building up on those all-glass windows. And they described it as looking into an aquarium, because that water got to almost 6 feet high before those windows started to splinter and crack. And they were still trying to get some food, some supplies up to the second floor. They were bypassing the stairs. They were just going into the ballroom and just throwing it up on the balcony. They were just throwing whatever they could because they wound up losing the better part of all their supplies. When the water got to be a little under 6 feet on these windows, they started to crack. And of course what happened was they exploded inward in the entire lobby of the Civic Center. I'm sure we've all been in the Civic Center. Everybody knows the Civic Center. It filled with water immediately, and it got almost to the first balcony. They were worried it was going to reach them on that first balcony. So they rose to more than 14 feet of water in under 30 minutes at the Civic Auditorium. Now, this is the way they described the water when it came in. They said, you know, it didn't kind of rise slowly. It kind of just rolled in like a river. This picture to me kind of shows the motion of the water. You can see the white caps and how it was moving in. And this is another photograph taken by one of the firemen there. And they described having to use a lot of ingenuity. And I still can't get a visual on this, but they used the salad bar to transport some of the non-ambulatory people up to the second floor. I don't understand how, but they did, and they said it really worked, and they used it and got them up there. But they got everybody up, all 250 people up before the water got there. And then here's Chalmette High School before and after. This is at the Parish Government Complex, where once again, just like every place else, the water came in. The thing about that was all the 911 calls had been diverted to the fire department communications office. So all night long, all those people who didn't evacuate are now calling 911 and saying, you know, this is pretty scary. Can somebody come get us? Well, the fire department dispatcher had to say, we can't come get you right now because all emergency services are grounded until the weather clears. They can't put the emergency workers in danger. So they compiled a list of all names and addresses. Those lists would be passed down to the boats when search and rescue started, and every address was checked. Now that Sheriff's Office mobile command unit that was going to be so valuable, that's it on the left. It was completely lost. They were really counting on that to be their center of communications. It was lost. On the right is the St. Bernard Fire Department Zodiac fireboat. It was the only boat they had there. The engine was flooded. The boat got caught under the roof, and that's Parish Councilman Craig Sparrow and Fire Inspector Mark Malonso. They worked for hours to get that boat running, and of course they never did. And then there is the Parish Complex before and after the water came up. This is St. Bernard Parish, Monday, August 29th, 2005. No communication, no power, and no outside help at all. It's estimated that 6,000 to 8,000 people stayed. So out there are those 6,000 to 8,000 people who are stranded. They need food, they need water, they need rescue, they need medical help, and ultimately they're going to need a way out of St. Bernard. And at this point, nobody knows how that's going to happen, really. But the fire department, in those 5 different factions throughout the parish, were mobilizing and formulating plans. But the people who had boats at their home were hopping in those boats, and they were getting to shelters. And here's Chalmette High School, the front of which they said looked like a port, just boats constantly coming and going. Chalmette High School would go from having 250 people that morning to having a little over 1,500 that evening. And then that's just another view of the boats just coming. What the firefighters would do is, when the boats would come, they'd unload the people, then they would get in the boats, go out, find other boats. Luckily, St. Bernard is huge with recreational and commercial fishing. Boats were not hard to find. A lot of people left their boats tied up with keys in them, so it wasn't hard to find boats. This is at St. Bernard High School. Once again, people start arriving there. They had about 150 signed in at the shelter. By the end of the day, they had over 500. This is at the Domino Sugar Refinery. That's the firefighters there unloading the boats, getting in the boats. This was not a shelter of last resort. They wound up with over 200 people there. And then here's the parish government complex. Once again, boats arriving there. That's the ladder headed down from the offices where they're passing down those lists from those 911 dump calls, and they're going out and checking all those addresses. And with that, the largest search and rescue operation in the history of St. Bernard is underway. As soon as those winds died down and they could get those boats out, they started search and rescue operations. Now, the fire department, the way they did it was they divided each group into 3 additional groups. And that was, one group of firefighters would take the boats out and rescue. Rescue from sunup to sundown. You were breaking into roofs, you were getting people out of their attics, you were just search and rescue. The second group was basically the ones who were EMTs. They stayed in those shelters, they cared for everyone, and there were a lot of sick, there were a lot of injured. The third group went out and looked for supplies. Now this is what the grocery stores look like. This is after the water went down. But they had to go in and they had to find supplies. They were looking for bottled water, bottled and canned drinks, juices, baby food, diapers, crackers, canned meat. They loved searching for feminine products. They had a good time with that one. And they had to find medicine. You know, I can remember a firefighter looking at me because they had to go into the pharmacies, they had to break into them. They had a rough time with breaking into things. But they had people going into diabetic comas who needed insulin, and they didn't know, you know, is wet insulin better than no insulin? What do we do? Do we get it? Well, they just took whatever they could find. They would load up the boats with the supplies, bring them back to the shelters. They did this around the clock. Because those 1,500 people that were that came into Chalmette High now had to be fed for an indefinite amount of time. Search and rescue began from the just going roof to roof, getting people, to the large-scale evacuation of the hospital, because all of the staff and patients from St. Bernard Memorial Hospital had to be removed, and I think that was done on either Tuesday or Wednesday. This is something that just, it touched me. I talked to the firefighters who actually are in this photograph doing this. They saw the cross at St. Mark. It was trapped under that little overhang, and they just felt they needed to go get it, and it was placed on Parish Road. I think everybody remembers seeing that cross on the way home. It really was a sign of hope. Once again, this is more rescue photographs from the firemen. They described, they were pulling people out of trees that had been hanging onto a tree for 48 hours. They found a woman with a 2-week-old baby floating in a doghouse. They found, and she had a cesarean and had been ripped open. They had found people floating in jacuzzis, just incredible stories. 2 firefighters told me that they had a man, an elderly man who was waving a white t-shirt out of a hole in his roof, and he said, I need help getting my wife out. So they went down in there, and she was propped up and sitting there, and they looked at her, and they knew she hadn't made it. And they explained to him that, well, we can't take her because we're doing rescue. We will come back for her when we start to recover. And he sat down and he said, I've been with her 50 years and I'm not leaving her now. And the fireman said, we understand. And they cried when they left him in that attic, and they cried when they told me that story. And I use it to illustrate what these first responders were facing and what they were seeing every minute of every day. All while none of them had had communication with their families. A lot of them didn't know if their families had reached their destinations. The two people that I talked about early on, Mike Molkamp, whose mother was at St. Bernard Manor, they organized to go in and evacuate the manor several days in. Captain Molkamp decided not to be a part of that contingent. He did not want to go down there. The water had reached 15 feet. It was on the second floor. His mother had first floor apartment. He did not know what they were going to find. He chose not to go. So that day he continued on his search and rescue operations, as was his job, when his radio went off. And it was Captain Eddie Estopanol, who I know very well because he was my son's captain. And Captain Estopanol had carried Mike Molkamp's mother on his back down 5 flights of stairs. And when Mike Molkamp's radio went off, all he heard was Captain Estopanol saying, I got your mama for you. And I just love that story. I can't ever tell that story without crying because he was crying when he told it to me. I love that it shows how these men had each other's backs. St. Rita's nursing home where Steve Galladoro's father was. Everybody knows what happened at St. Rita's. Steve Galladoro was a firefighter for over 30 years. I met with him on a Saturday for over 5 hours, and he kept repeating to me, I lost my way, and I didn't understand what Steve meant. But he went down there and decided to find out what happened, and of course he found 35 bodies, and one of them was his father. So he radioed in and said he needed 35 body bags because he was going to start recovering. But they said they didn't have 35, and he said, well then I need you to give me 1 because I'm going to recover 1. And they came back and said, we don't have 1. And they said, we can give you a black garbage bag. And luckily, one of the finest men I've ever met, Deputy Chief Riley Richards, was there, and he said, Steve, you don't want to do this. You can't do this. And Steve told me, he said, I lost my way because as a firefighter, it's my duty to rescue first and then recover. But I was torn in my duty as a firefighter and my duty as a son. I felt I owed it to my dad to recover his body at that point. He said, but eventually I knew what I had to do. And he got in the boat and he left. And the recovery happened several days later, and he chose not to be part of it. But he knew what his duty was as a firefighter, but he took his pain and he went back to the shelters, and he would find firefighters who looked like they were having a rough time, and he would kind of help them through. At this point, the duration was really getting to them. They said they're trained in the fire academy that for the first few hours of emergencies you're on your own, but then the cavalry is coming. Well, it never came. And they were completely on their own. This photograph shows the faces of the firefighters, and this is where they were at that point. Things were getting tough. Rations were getting low. Doris Voce described the living condition in the shelters as some subhuman conditions at this point. They had no clean clothes. They had hardly any food. They were sleeping on the roof. They had no communication with their families. Yet they still had all these people that they needed to rescue. Then they had to deal with what was in the water that they were hopping in and out of every day. And the list of contaminants: household cleaning chemicals, automobile fluids, fuel, trash, human and animal waste, petrochemical toxins from the refineries, obviously all the rotting food, and the mass decomposing of dead human and animal bodies. All this is in the water for days and days. And they've got open cuts and sores. They're banging themselves on the boats. Many of them would suffer from staph infections. And then on top of the largest natural disaster comes the largest residential oil spill at Murphy Oil, where 1.5 million gallons of crude oil is released into the water. And you can see the oil slick there heading into the neighborhoods. That added many dangerous cancer-causing carcinogens into that flood water. On day 5, or by day 5, all the shelters were evacuated. This is the Coast Guard had come to help evacuate injured or ill residents from the roof at St. Bernard High School. This is where there was the young 16-year-old pregnant girl whose water bag broke that day. They lifted her off the roof and she gave birth less than 24 hours later. The fire department lost all their equipment in Katrina except the 4 engines that Chief Stone sent to Holden, Louisiana. It was all they had left. They lost every fire station. Obviously at engine 11 down there, it was completely gone. And that's engine 6 and Mira. Pretty bad. When I asked the firefighters where did this rank as far as things they'd gone through in their lives, across the board, every one of them said it was the most difficult thing I have ever been through in my life. Then I asked them, well, would you do it again? And they all said, well, of course. It's our job. And that's the reason I wrote this book, because I think they are all heroes, every one of them. I can only touch the surface of what happened and what they went through and what they did. But truly, all the first responders in this storm are heroes. Thank you.
Wow. What more can you talk about? More emotional now, but my compliments to Dr. Manning for putting this together for us today. My thanks go to you for always being there, because you're the reason we still do this. And I'd like to say that, Michelle, you really got me. My heart swells with pride to know that I live in a place where people like this exist, where we came together as a community and recovered from the greatest natural disaster that the country has known. It gives me a great deal of pride. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.